I guess we can kick this off. Welcome, guys, and welcome everyone to the panel discussion on digital twin that we're implementing here in Canada through the Canada Underground Infrastructure Register. So this is an initiative that is based loosely on the National Underground Asset Register in the UK that has been underway for, I guess, about 18 months, maybe 2 years now. Jeff, I think you've been involved in that.
Yep.
And I've been in discussions with them for a number of, just about 2 years. I had discussions early on with JD Maniscalco at Colorado One Call about doing something similar to this. And when I saw what the UK folks were doing, I thought it was a perfect opportunity for us to get on board as well and create that same underground infrastructure register for Canada in support of a digital twin, which I think everybody in the conference has seen what capabilities the digital twin provides to all the stakeholders. We've been underway for about 6 months, putting a team together and reaching out to the stakeholder groups to try and get representation and just elevate everybody's awareness of what we're doing. So with that, my background, by the way, mainly in construction years ago, oil and gas business, and then went consulting and software. And now I'm retired. Well, thankfully, I'm over 70 years old. I should be retired by now. But anyway, so I'm working with this wonderful group to put together this Canadian Underground Infrastructure Register to elevate, if you will, the damage prevention processes in Canada to not only save lives and keep people safer, but also to get some more efficiency into the existing system and to make sure that everyone benefits from this initiative, including all the utility companies, all the construction companies, all the workers, the public, the government at all levels, and just the economy overall, because we know there's an incredible cost savings to be had, because damage to existing infrastructure today is very, very costly and has a major impact, downward impact or negative impact on the economy. So with that being said, gentlemen, I'll get each of you to introduce yourselves, and we'll start with the youngest fellow at first. I'm not sure who that might be, but I'm thinking it might be Wilson.
All right, we'll fight Wilson for it.
So I'll just briefly introduce myself. My name is Wilson Phillips. I'm from Professional Surveyors Canada, or I'm representing Professional Surveyors Canada. We've been working on underground infrastructure mapping for, I don't know, I've been in it for about 10 years or so, working on registries specifically and how they might work, copying systems or looking into systems across Canada and throughout the world, much of the same things that Jeff has been working on. And we've been following standards such as the CSA 250 and the ASE 3802 and developments like that. From our members' point of view, it's more like where can this data live? We're very cognizant of registries because we work in registries all the time. So we're familiar with how registries work and how they don't work and what limitations they have. So we tried to investigate as much as possible what systems will work and what systems don't work, both in Canada and outside of Canada, and what could make things a little bit better. From our point of view, we've looked into why there is data siloing in different, not only in underground infrastructure registries, but well, there isn't any that really exists, but why you get data silos and what initiatives were started by governments and other agencies that resulted in data silos to try and avoid that. Looked into a lot of the no's. So we weren't, a lot of people are on board with, as you've seen in the conference today, there's a lot of people doing innovative stuff that's really good in digital twins, and some of the universities are working incredibly hard on it, not only in Canada, but in Singapore and throughout the world. But what we wanted to find out was what were the no's, who was saying no to it, and why were they saying no to it? So we investigated that as much as we possibly could. We looked at why systems work, such as our current Interact system, how they started, how they work, why data gets shared and how it gets shared, even though it's extremely private information. So we did a lot of investigating like that prior to coming up with our position papers, and there'll be one coming out in the spring as well. So that's just a little background of what we've been working on. Right now, I'm working on funding, long-term funding for registry models that would work. That's a little bit from me.
Perfect, thank you. Lawrence?
I'll fight Wilson for who's the youngest. We'll have to see. We'll figure it out after. Maybe I'll have to shave the beard a little bit. Make me look we'll have to see. But thanks, Steve, and thanks to everyone on this panel and everyone attending today. Just a little bit of my background. I'm kind of, as part of the committee, wearing two hats. So one of them in my kind of the thing that puts food on the table. I'm the president at Foresight Utility Engineers, so been doing subsurface utility engineering and utility engineering work for about the last 20 or so years. Done work right across Canada and in the US, and had not only been able to work on a lot of actual projects, but also had the pleasure to sit on a number of committees. Sat on the committee to help rewrite the ASC 38, hopefully 22, as well as the CSA S250 committee. I'm vice chair of that committee right now. The other hat that I'm wearing is my chair hat for the Transportation Association of Canada's Public Utilities Management Subcommittee. And so Steve reached out to TAC and sort of got in touch with me through that. And that group, if you're not familiar with, we're doing a lot of great work over the last about 18 years now. I've been part of the committee for about the last 12, and I think chairing it for about the last 7 or 8. But we've been able to publish a lot of great documents in terms of the placement of utilities in the public right-of-way. And also the last couple of documents we put together are associated with utility coordination aspects and how to essentially manage those utilities in the right-of-way. So I'm kind of wearing both hats, very interested. This has obviously been a topic of discussion for a long time now. For the uninitiated, anytime I try to tell somebody what I do for a living, their first thing is, why don't we have a map of the underground utilities? Why do you even have a job? Like, what's happening? So it's unfortunate that we've kind of put ourselves in the situation that we're in right now. It's going to be a bit of a Herculean effort to get us back to, I think, where we all wish we could be. But with any of those efforts, you got to start somewhere. So it's good to see this this group taking that on, and obviously it'd be good to see some discussion on today's session.
Jeff?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. You know, I've been following underground infrastructure in various parts of the world. There's only a few places that I haven't gone and seen what maybe a local community is doing, what a city is doing, what a region is doing, what a nation is doing, or whatever. And I've been doing that for about 25, 30 years. And over those years, I've collected, you know, sort of different information about how different jurisdictions have dealt with this challenge. And I think I've sort of tried to categorize those into, you know, 4 or 5, 6 categories or something like that. In some jurisdictions, it's a government mandate. In other words, the government says, here's what you have to do. If you're a utility or a telecom or a contractor or whatever in this country, this is what you have to do. And I'll give, you know, a couple of examples would be Flanders, the CLIP system in Flanders, the CLIC system in the Netherlands. You heard about the DT-DIC system in France this morning. That's government mandated. In the US, federally regulated pipelines are controlled by a federally mandated organization called PHMSA, PHMSA. And you've heard about Colorado today several times from ProStar and others. And it's basically, it's government mandated plus regulation through the Colorado DOT. And I could name some other countries, you know, Japan, Calgary, for example. Calgary in Alberta has had a system for capturing and sharing information about underground utilities for a long, long time. Then there's government voluntary. The vault system in Scotland is a classic example. It started around 2012 or whatever, just a bunch of utilities and the government transportation agencies just getting together and say, listen, wouldn't it make more sense if we shared data? And I guess there has been a tradition of collaboration in Scotland. The National Underground Asset Register that Steve has referred to, which is England, Wales, Northern Ireland, doesn't include Scotland because Scotland has vault, is also voluntary. They don't like to use the word voluntary, but the reality is there's nothing that mandates that you as a utility or telecom have to participate in this effort. They're hoping that people will just, that utilities and telecoms will just realize that there's tremendous value in this. The government's basically funding it. So then there's other organizations like NGO consortia. And I'd mention a couple of examples. DigDat in the UK, which is Anglian Water. It's a number of water companies that have just got together and said, we're going to share. I don't think there's any government involvement in this. I know there was an organization in Pernambuco in Brazil where just some utilities and telecoms got together and say, wouldn't it make more sense if we shared this information? And in British Columbia, there's a really, really interesting example, the ICI Society. It's not specifically focused on reducing damage during construction, but it's basically a bunch of utilities that have gotten together and said, wouldn't it make more sense if we shared data? There's also mandated industry consortia, and I guess I would classify the one-call systems in most U.S. states and Canadian provinces as that. I mean, there's legislation that requires utilities, telecoms, or whatever to pay money to support the one-call system. It means that they have to be available to send out crews, locate crews or contractors. When anybody calls in and says, I'm going to dig within 3 days, they have to go out there and try to find where their infrastructure is and paint the ground. There's some places it's regulation, Colorado, Montana. There's enabling legislation, but the actual details of what has to happen is regulation. I could mention Ofwat, which is the water regulator in the UK and some other places too. Then there's industry associations. I think everybody here will be familiar with the Common Ground Alliance. There's different branches of it. There's a Canadian one, there's an Ontario one, and there's the US has one, and they collect basically voluntarily submitted information about underground damage. In the UK, there's something called the Utility Strike Avoidance Group, which is attempting to do the same thing. And then there's private for-profit companies that do this. A classic example is Line Search Before You Dig in the UK. They have about 100% of the gas companies in the UK, something like 60, 70% of the electric companies. So it's not, they haven't got everything, but they have got a lot. And you've probably heard of Pelican Corp, which does a lot of this kind of same kind of thing in Australia, US, UK, Singapore, and Canada. And then in some jurisdictions, just purely contractual. Right now in Singapore, if you do any work underground, it's contract. There's a element in the contract that says that you have to do it in a particular way, which means accurate as-built, and you have to use particular equipment for that. And then, of course, there's airports, there's universities, there's ports, hospitals, industrial campuses, and so on. Some of them are private, some of them are maybe provincial, some of them are maybe run by a city, and so on. So there's a lot. I guess the main point is that there's a lot of different ways of doing this. The second point I'd like to make is that this is not a technical problem. And we've heard about a number of companies talking about how they have technology to do this. So I really don't think this is a technical problem. I think this is an organizational problem. How do we get people together to share data? And one of the big questions is, should this be mandatory? Should it be something that the province says you have to do this? Or is it something that could be voluntary, where basically the industry gets together and says, look, let's just figure out a way to do this and we'll do it ourselves without government involvement. The third thing I'd like to say is that one of the biggest issues is data sources. In other words, where do you get the data from? And this is related to data quality. I think most people who've had any experience with existing records from utilities or telecoms realize that there is a problem there, that you can't get this information from utilities and telecoms and rely on it. And that's one of the reasons why one call systems in North America require utilities and telecoms in most jurisdictions to go out and actually use EM devices or ground penetrating radar to find out where things are. And that's because the records are just not that reliable. And then the final thing I'd like to mention, this really was one of the key reasons that NUR has been as successful during its pilots as it has been, is that there has to be some kind of a framework for sharing. In general, I mean, it could just be agreement between a number of utilities saying this is the rules we're going to have for sharing data, and the telecoms, could say, well, we want to do it this way, and the water companies can say we want to do it this way. But there's rules and there's data, schemes for data protection. But in the case of NUR, it's basically a legal framework, and they're working on that right now. That's probably the lion's share of the effort that's going into NUR right now, is basically a legal framework where all the utilities and telecoms agree that this is the basis for how they're going to share their data.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I do have a question, and it comes from the existing system that's in place. I mean, the one call system currently prevents a lot of damage, and it's slowly improving year by year through the efforts of people like CCGA and the CGA and the one call centers. I can't imagine what our current environment would look like if we didn't have a one call center. It was a Wild West show and everybody just did their own thing out there. So the question that I would have is what would be the motivation and what are the benefits for people, for the stakeholders to get involved and support the Underground Infrastructure Register initiative? Now, I know that the UK has identified not only the cost, both the direct costs and societal costs, which are the incidental damages and impact on society and the economy overall, but they also identified the benefits for each and every one of the stakeholders. And there were no negatives that I saw. So I guess my question to each of you is, for the groups that you represent, what do you think the benefits are from your perspective and for the organization or organizations that you represent?
So I think the benefits are endless, and I think a lot of them are obvious. To me, there's a few different stages at which this data could be used. And Steve, you mentioned the one call, which is obviously pre-construction, and there's an obvious need for good, accurate information there, because the better. A lot of times I'll equate it to the cover on a puzzle, right? If you've got a good the box and you can see what you're trying to find, it's a lot easier to put the puzzle together, which is what a lot of these guys are doing every day in the field. So the better the data, the better we are. The other stage, and the stage that I get more involved with on my career side, is the engineering and design side of things. So the better the data that we can plug into those engineering and designs, the better off we are in the long run. Now, I think that's one of the things that comes up all the time. And there's, I think, isolated examples of where we have data. And I think we've mentioned the Calgary, the jump system. There's the DMOG and CU mapping in Toronto. There's I can't remember what it's called, but the GIS system, Geo Ottawa, I believe it's called, in Ottawa, that has data. I think the key with all that is, and we talked about it, is some of the figuring out what the accuracy of that data is, and dependent on the accuracy of that data, what can it be best used for? Is it best used to help guide the one call locators in the field to know where they're looking at? Is it best used to guide engineering and planning decisions so that you know where to go in and supplement it with a higher quality information, which kind of feeds right in with the ASC 38 standard that's out there. So I think that's one of the key things to figure out, is what we're using the data for, and then therefore what kind of data we need to collect in order for it to serve those purposes.
I think there's a lot of positives, and you can draw on in survey registry world years ago, all of it was registry, and Newfoundland is still a complete land registry system. They haven't gone to a Torrens system or anything like that. And I don't want to get into I won't get into the details of it, but one is more of an active system where if something happens to land, it gets registered. In an old deeded registry system like they have in Newfoundland, you can do land transfers and not register them. So there's the positive aspect of it I think you brought that up, Steve, is it's not just the damage prevention. Oh, it's going to save money and it's going to save lives. If you have a lot of good information, and this is to Lawrence's point, if you have a lot of good information, or at least something, the top of the puzzle box, you're so much more productive, you're so much more efficient in looking. And you can see that in the land-based system that they have in Ontario and Manitoba and BC. Now, if you didn't have that cadastral land-based system, you have no place to start. You don't have that top of puzzle box. So I think it's important that there's an interactive system where if you get better data, it can get updated. That's the whole goal. Is if you just have data and it never gets updated, like surveyors across Canada pick up really accurate data every day and it goes nowhere. We give it to the engineer, we give it to the architect, and that's it. And so then a year later, we go back and do the exact same thing. Now, to Jeff's point, is the innovations in technology, like we saw this morning with the digital capture cameras and stuff like that. You get a ton of data, but it's like anything. I need to be able to talk to Lawrence, and Lawrence needs to be able to talk to me, and I need to be able to talk to you in a common language that we can both understand. And that's where the muddy models and the different models that we come into, but you need to have that level of training to understand when Lawrence sees something and he says, okay, well, a pipe was located to within, half a meter or something like that. What type of pipe is it? When was it put in? That kind of stuff. The more metadata that he can have, the better his design can be. So I think there's so many more benefits than just the hazard protection and the risk avoidance that from my point of view, from members' point of view, it's just like it's a no-brainer, but it's a matter of where are those no's and how can we overcome them.
Yeah, and then those are a big part. And I think, Wilson, you bring up a good point. One of the biggest challenges is actually understanding the accuracy of that data, right? And someone goes out in the field and finds something that's slightly different. Is that better than the data that's in the record? What are they using to collect that data? What was used to collect the data that's in there right now, right? Which one takes precedent? Who makes a decision of which one takes precedent? What's the qualifications of the person that built that? You might have an as-built and they actually looking at the CSAS 250, you can have something to CSAS 250 level 1, right? And so someone surveyed that thing in as they put it in the ground, and very accurately, someone goes back after and tries to sonde it or GPR it, which one's more accurate. And so I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is making sure that we've got a system robust enough that has enough metadata in it so that you can make those decisions on that data. To your point, if we're not updating it constantly, it's not a beneficial system. But at the same time, if we're updating constantly and going around in circles with which data is more important, it's almost just as bad.
Yeah, and what we looked at too was insurability. So right now, the model, I guess you'd say, was some entity will have this thing, but it won't have any responsibility. And that was a failed model. You couldn't do that. Like, let's say if you're building the Interact system or any other kind of system where trust between entities is paramount. And I use the Interact system because it's just so important, because everybody uses it every day, but we don't realize what the machinations are behind the scenes and how that got started. But you need to be able to insure that away. So in other words, if the locator is insured and they're guaranteeing something for whatever, and a surveyor is insured and they're conducting this practice, and the engineer is insured and the architect's insured for whatever level of stuff that they're doing, you disperse that risk down so that whatever entity you actually have isn't capturing that. I asked the question of the DT Dick guy this morning, who did a great presentation, but I think he kind of missed my answer a little bit. Was I was talking about insurance, and so what we looked into is how could we reduce the insurance cost for everybody in the spectrum, because construction companies are very interested in that because the costs are so high. But how could we reduce the insurance cost, the total insurance cost, and spread that out for a system that would operate that.
Mhm.
So very much to your point there, Lawrence, is who's doing what and who's guaranteeing that.
Yeah.
When you say that something's to CSA 250 standard, who said that?
Yeah. Are they a competent individual as per the standard?
Yeah, and
Exactly.
then once you start asking the competent individual question, then that triggers a whole bunch of other things, you know. But we wanted to look at it from a holistic point of view. There's a lot of locators out there that do great work, and they're able to capture a lot of data, and they need to be able to operate in that system. You know, it's just a matter of how do you integrate that stuff and who's doing the verification in the back end of it. That you don't need to have everything perfect. You just need to have some level of classification.
Yeah, and I think that the key point and what's kind of different with this than a lot of other systems is the reality is we're probably never going to get it perfect because you can't see all this stuff that's under the ground and you're never going to see it, right? So I think we got to, number one, draw a line in the sand in terms of everything from a go forward basis. This is the way we want to collect it, and this is the way we want to capture it. And then you've got all the stuff that's already in the ground, and how do we capture that into the thing we just talked about? How do we sign the accuracy or the quality to that data, right?
Yeah,
It's a complicated issue.
Yeah, so I do have some questions, guys, from the attendees here. So for Wilson says, who's not been willing to share data and why? So you don't have to name any names, but maybe just give some sort of indication as to why they were concerned about sharing the data and how that might be addressed.
Yeah, so we really looked at the no's, and the no's were basically coming from telcos, but I don't want to throw telcos under the bus, but the reason why they reacted in such a way earlier on was because they weren't mandated to, they were under a different legislation. But I don't think there was nothing malicious about it. It's that there was no infrastructure in place with which to do it. So the same kind of thing happened initially with ICI Society and other initiatives, and I'm sure Jeff can speak to this, was some people would just say no because they don't have any infrastructure with which to do it. And the infrastructure is money. And so that triggered us to say, well, what happens if money wasn't an issue? What if we could get you money? Okay, so then you could have an infrastructure, and then we make the footprint as low maintenance as possible for you, like the ICI system does in BC, where the footprint is remarkably low. They don't have to do anything. They really don't have to do hardly anything. And their input costs are relatively low, although they're self-funding. So then we looked at it from well, how can we get rid of the self-funding? Because the self-funding is a limiter. It sounds great, you know, sort of like the one call systems, but you'll never get innovation. You won't have enough money to innovate. And so there's all these great companies out there, VGIS and all the companies that we saw today, that rely on capturing data and putting it into a system, moving it back and forth. And those are private companies. They need data, and they need a two-way, an ACNAC system. And you can't do that for free, or you can only do it for free for so long, and then it becomes a silo, and it's just like, oh well. You know, the DT Dick guy was saying this morning, well, you know, we have a lot of guys in France that don't just, you know, don't participate and stuff like that because there's a cost to it. But that was it's a good model, but you still need to have that funding. You need to have a steady source of funding of so that not just the users of the data, like in a land registry system, it's not just the users of the data that are paying for it, it's consumers are paying for it. When you go to get a car loan, you're paying for a little bit of that in your land titling system. Every little fee starts to add up. And if you have millions of fees, you can charge people pennies and you can still raise millions of dollars.
Yeah, so the fellow from the Dick in France, the DT Dick system mentioned that they had 93% participation from the majors. Yeah. And wouldn't that be wonderful? We had 93% of the utilities in Canada participating. Yeah. So it has to be, you know, a major impact if we can get them all involved.
Building on what Wilson said there, obviously money comes down to the root of all these things, right? But I think, and Wilson brings up a good point in terms of the costs associated with putting the system in and all that is one piece of it. But getting back to why would some be unwilling to share? And this is again, after 20 years of discussion at many committees, for a company that's highly competitive in the telecom world, there's money associated with knowing that they've got access and ducts that can service a certain area that they don't want the competition to know is there. So there's the two different sides of the money, but they both play into the equation, because I've never heard complaints from like an Enbridge or a pipeline or whatever those, because they may not be perfect monopolies, but they're as close as you get in the utility world, if you know what I mean.
So how do we address that specific concern with the register project? And I think one of the things that we said was that we would utilize the one call design request ticket process, where they just get to see a little keyhole on the map, a little inset of the map that's their proposed work site, and the data that's provided only covers that area. So if I'm a telco and I've got assets down that street, my competitor is going to know I've got assets down that street anyway if they put in a one call ticket.
Yeah.
So I see nothing different here, as long as it's limited to the confines of that one call ticket, that design ticket, or that locate request if it's an actual excavation. So it's not like we're creating a database that other people can access and see the overall picture. They just get to see a little tiny snippet of your data. And in fact, they don't even get to touch your database. We're going to send the data just to fulfill that ticket.
But I think that's where, from a security standpoint and some of the governance, in order to make the telecoms have peace of mind, some of that needs to be laid out, sort of the rules of engagement, so to speak, and what can be done and what cannot be done with that data.
Yeah, in a funny story, in the United States, there's been excavators that have hit phantom lines in the United States, which weren't supposed to be there, and then nobody knew who is this, and it's run by a security agency, and they don't want to share anything either. Yeah. So you can have systems that don't allow you to see everything. You know, if you're even a high level database manager managing interoperable data between banks in Canada, they can't see what my bank records are, but they know there's data transferring between a transaction went between them. So there are ways of limiting things, but that's getting into the very, very technical stuff. Like Jeff said, there's technicalities, but they can all be overcome if you have the money.
Yeah, well, and I think we kind of get into the point, and Jeff did a good job of outlining at the beginning how some of the systems around the world are governed and pushed. So whether it's a government run system and a mandatory system or a privately run system, and I know that that's again one of those fundamental decisions that we need to make in terms of this group early on, so that we can lay that foundation that everything builds up on, because how we go about building it will look very different depending if, for example, the province of Ontario gets in right in behind it and agrees to fund some money and some technical ability and all that, will look different than if it goes through a one call system. Or I know there's providers on our panel like 4M, if it goes through a system like that, it'll look very different. So I think that's one of the things that fundamentally we need to decide what the utility sharing that information and what the user of that information feel most comfortable with, and what's going to get us the most value long-term with that data. There's obviously pros and cons either way.
Yeah, long-term is the key there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Jeff, what are your thoughts on the benefits to the stakeholders and the cost to each of the stakeholders?
Well, I've thought about this, and I look at the broad categories of contractors, surveyors, which, Wilson's already talked about, network operators or owners, on government transportation agencies, engineering companies, the locate industry. I mean, there's a lot more than that. I mean, I could probably list 23 or 24 different stakeholders that are involved. And when you look at those, with the contractors, in the United States, and I think it's the same thing in Canada, the biggest cause of delays on construction projects is underground utilities. Right? I mean, everybody's known that for years. I mean, and I think people have, if they haven't known the number that, CGA says it's $30 billion it costs the U.S. economy. I think it's much more than that when you include indirect costs like traffic holdups and, loss of customs and things like that. So, and contractors, contracting is a low margin business. I think most people would agree. And I talked to somebody from AXA, which is a big construction insurance company. This is getting back to the point of how important insurance is in this, I think, which I think Wilson brought up. And he said that, a contractor, doing maybe $25 to $40 million a year, this is a mom and pop contractor, $25 to $40 million a year, would pay $1 million in insurance. Right? Anything that we could do, or that a system like this could do to reduce the risk of underground utilities delaying, causing over budget runs or whatever, could go right to the bottom line for contractors. And they're low margin, so that even if you could chip off 20% of their insurance costs, that could be a significant benefit to contractors. So I think I would say contractors are and I think it's borne out from Colorado, from the experience in Colorado, where there's some major contractors that were involved in that right from the beginning. And the other guys that I think it's a no-brainer is government transportation agencies. I think that's what motivated in Colorado. CDOT says this is ridiculous how much money we're, and how many project overruns we have and how many project delays we have. Isn't there something we can do to, bring the cost down? And also,
the one thing, Jeff, though, that's very different, and this based on my work in Canada and the US.
Yeah.
In the US, the state DOTs will be responsible or to have ownership on a lot more of the roads that in Canada would be upper tier municipal road,
right?
A lower tier municipal road. So
right.
You go to Florida DOT, you've got a huge cross section of roads.
Sure.
There. You go to MTO in Ontario, you got the 401 and the 400 series highways, but then you got to go talk to the region of Durham, region of York, region of thing. You got to talk to all these people. So there's a lot more collaboration required behind doing that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I remember when I was involved in a project, an underground project in Las Vegas, some of those roads going through Las Vegas are state right of way, and some of them are city right of way, and some of them are county right of way, and Clark County and the state and the city don't agree on anything. Right, which probably held up everything. And I think what you're suggesting, Lawrence, is that this may be even a bigger problem in Canada, because
it just requires more collaboration, and you got to get more people on board to agree.
Yeah. But I think, getting back, I think the government transportation agencies recognize that there is a significant benefit in having better information about the underground. Right. So to me, the two organizations, and I think it's borne out by Colorado, that it's a no-brainer, you don't even have to get up and argue with them, is state transportation or city municipal, like you said, Lawrence, municipal transportation agencies, and also contractors. When you start looking at network operators and telecoms, it gets a lot more complicated. And you've already heard what Wilson had to said. He said even in their case that you can find maybe liabilities is something that they would see some significant benefit from this. But I think it's a little bit more complicated with those guys. Engineering companies, you'd think that there would be significant benefits because they would know where the utilities were underground during planning and design, and wouldn't have to do a whole bunch of rework during the planning design. And the locate industry, I'm not sure. It's hard to tell with locate. I would think there'd be huge opportunities with something like this register for those locate industries, because the data we currently have is so bad. You think it would just be a huge opportunity for the locate industry, but it's hard to say. I really haven't talked to enough people in the locate industry.
I just read something through the CGA the other day that said that going digital is going to have a major shortfall of locators and surveyors and sue companies to provide all the data that's needed to support the digitization, these sorts of records.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a huge opportunity for the locate industry. But I think the challenge is that, in North America, and Lawrence, you can correct me, but I think the requirements for what level of training or certification you need, it's nowhere near what you need to be a surveyor. I think Lawrence and Wilson, you can correct me on that. And that was a question I was really interested with Patrice this morning, talking about the DT Dick system, whether they, I know that, for example, Heathrow Airport in the UK, there are very rigid requirements on your level of certification and training and whatever before you get involved in doing any locating at Heathrow. And I think in North America, it's fairly lax, and I was interested in what it was in France.
Yeah, it's definitely nowhere near what it would be to be a professional land surveyor, professional engineer, or anything like that. But
So gentlemen, we do have some questions coming in. So the first one was to find money, what ROI approach or studies do you think would work best? And I know that the folks on the newer project did a benefit cost ratio analysis, and it came up positive right across the board. Any
More
thoughts on
than
that?
positive, 1 to 30. They said for every pound invested, the benefits were 30, but that rests on a lot of suppositions and assumptions. Yeah, so.
What about since you're talking about telecom, the question comes from Natalie, and she says, are there considerations for current issues with installation of fiber optics on the seabed? So I imagine that seabed could also include something across a lake or a river, perhaps. I mean, anything underwater. And I can imagine that we may do something along those lines, directly drill it or bore it across the river, for instance, that they'd capture that data and make that available to the utility owner.
yeah, funny enough, we just finished a project about 2 weeks ago for mapping underground cables under a lake here, not too far by in Scugog. So we mapped 11 kilometers of underground cable. It was essentially CCTV cable, and so cable TV, and it's not much different though. Like from a consideration standpoint, I'm not sure what it is, but I think you'd want to show that on the maps, just like you would show it if it's buried under the ground.
Well, you wouldn't want a ship dragging an anchor across the lake because we're in a storm, for instance.
Well, and I know, like, as a matter of fact, when we were doing it, we were locating some of them, and the signal would die, and the guys don't know why, obviously at the time. Then you go back and have a discussion with the client. You're like, oh, that's where we had to do a splice because a ship connected on it and ripped it. And obviously when they did the splice connection, they didn't connect the grounds properly. And so there's some technical complexities associated with it.
Yeah, a colleague of mine did one, all the stuff that's under sea will get surveyed federally. So communications cables that are on the offshore will be under Canada Land Surveys regulations. So, but like Lawrence pointed out, that's a huge risk. Undersea cables are a huge risk, and they have to bury them close to shore, even under the water, because of the danger of anchors and even rock falls on the sides of underwater cliffs and stuff. There's lots of issues that can come up.
Perfect. And we've got a few minutes yet. We can go beyond if we need to. Another question from Forrest Sim. He says, would you be in favor of a mandated licensure, a voluntary certification, or something else to get locators, sue firms, and others to adhere by the same standards? Or should we continue to move forward with the current market-driven system that benefits good locators with more business and punishes bad locators with less business?
I think one of the things you got to clarify is the difference between a locator, a surveyor, and an engineer picking up that stuff. There's certain things they can do. I know there's a lot of work right now being done by UESI, for example, and some other ones to put some of those, exactly what you're saying, some of those qualifications associated with what it means to be a SUE technician, for example, and what qualifications they should have. So I think training as a whole and standardizing some of that makes a lot of sense. But to what I was saying at the beginning, just because you have a locator that's well trained, does that locator trained to give a quality level on a drawing and to be able to tie that in with accuracy such that it could qualify for a CSA S250 accuracy level? And I think that that's where you got to leave that work to those that know what they're doing, so to speak.
Yeah, we looked into that, and as soon as you get into the qualification thing, that opens up another can of worms of who's going to qualify that. Obviously, the professional level people already have to have their own insurance. You don't have to worry about them having insurance, because if they screwed something up, they can lose their licensure, and that's not going to happen. See, it's sort of a, if you're getting below that level, then that's where we started talking about the distribution of liability through insurance. and so that you can have multiple layers of people or locators or qualifications for that. It's just different levels of insurance, I guess you'd say. But if Lawrence is doing a SUE job, I know he's a licensed engineer in Canada. I don't need to look beyond that.
Yeah, and just not to point out, but I won't say who it was, but I saw a presentation earlier today where someone was assigning quality levels and going out and putting things in the field, and it was just downright wrong. Right. So we can't have people assigning those kind of things that aren't trained and don't know what they're doing, or else the whole data itself falls apart because there's nothing behind it.
Wilson, when a surveyor goes out and does underground locate, first of all, is that legal, and how does that relate to his licensing and insurance?
So there's different levels of stuff that we might do in qualification of the data. So if a professional surveyor goes out and he or she locates anything, their insurance is going to cover them. So that, and if they screw anything up, it is still, everything is a purview to their licensure. So in other words, I don't get to say, well, I was doing this, so I'm exempt from anything. It's no different than the engineers or the architects. So you're always liable. And in the case of surveyors in particular, and except for a few provinces, their liabilities extend forever. So I know the engineers in Manitoba just got their liability reduced, I think, to 30 years, I think now, which theirs used to be like 40 or 50 years. But a lot of surveyors in Canada, their liabilities extend for forever. So it's a bit of a problem, actually. But the qualification is always gone with the locate stuff. So if a surveyor is locating something and they're using EM locations, or if we're getting sometimes we'll work with an engineering firm to, I'm just talking about myself, but a lot of firms are multidisciplinary. So if they're doing GPR or something like that, and the engineers are viewing the accuracy of the GPR data related to the spatial data that might have been done, and whether it falls within a property line or whether it's actually in a street corridor, there's multiple levels to it. So those are mostly technical things.
Would this inhibit a surveyor from doing underground locates?
I don't envision it preventing surveyors from doing underground locates. We do them every day in Canada.
Okay, great.
Forever. So
yeah, I think the key is you've got to be competent with what you're doing, and then how you're assigning it, and how you're showing that information, right? Like, I think competent people can do a lot of things, but in terms of, like, for example, assigning quality levels and calling it compliant with the ASC 38 standard here in Canada, anyways, that's something that's signed off by a professional engineer, right? Yes. And it's really a multidisciplinary thing, because you have to have an understanding, kind of like what Wilson was saying, understanding of the equipment used to gather that information, and the reliability of that technique and used in that situation. Obviously be in responsible charge of the person collecting that information, because you're putting your sign and seal on that data that was collected. And then there's obviously the survey component to it, because you've got to pick it in and tie it in with the existing project level coordinates or survey coordinates for that project, and make sure it all fits together at the end of the day for the overall project. So there's a lot of different aspects of it that all have to line up, and whoever is going to sign off needs to know exactly what's going on with each of those stages and take responsibility for it.
Yeah, one of the funny things that we get in survey world is you get a specification that says that this thing will be whatever, the underground infrastructure will be located with GPS coordinates, and every surveyor in Canada just laughs. And you try and talk to somebody that's not in that field, and you say, well, what datum do you want? What vertical datum? What horizontal datum are you using? And it's just glass over. Like you go, like, just in Manitoba, if you go from CVGB 2013 to HT 202, you could have a vertical displacement of half a meter easily, just locally. So you're talking about two different things. And then, as they talked about in on one of the presentations where they were reducing things to center of pipe, is it the center of pipe, top of pipe? Sometimes we'll get specifications. We want this located quickly to within a centimeter. They're locating it with EM locators, which are like 5 to 10% of the depth,
Yeah.
And when we laugh, we get the same chuckles that you guys do.
Yeah.
But it's just from a lack of understanding, and you try and calmly explain to people, well, if we're going to go out there and locate it with an EM locator, I can't guarantee it to this depth, like you have to be reasonable. If you want us to pothole the hell out of this thing, then yeah, you can have it really accurate. But in reality, like Lawrence, I think had mentioned, I think Steve had mentioned too, you have different quality levels, and how are you going to ensure that quality level, and who's signing off on it? You need to have what you're talking about with a registry, where you're getting that back and forth, is people are having a conversation about data. And so if I get data out of a registry, and whatever the registry holder is telling me that it's within half a meter, that registry needs to know that the information came in to within half a meter horizontally and maybe a meter vertically, and it was captured by so-and-so, and it was signed off by so-and-so.
Yeah.
Or it was just data that came from a plan from TELUS, or we don't know the accuracy. And that's why the specifications are so important for different standards, so you can have an informed conversation.
Yeah.
Precisely. Well, gentlemen, I think we're pretty much out of time here. We're about 10 minutes over, but I think we're golden here. So thank you very much. And if anybody is interested in the project that we're all working on, if they would send an email perhaps to Tessa, I guess, or to the SUMSF team, we will get some materials to you so you can understand what it is we're trying to achieve and how we're going to do it. Also, hopefully enlist the right parties, the right stakeholder groups to help us put this together to everybody's benefit.